Disrespect in the courtroom was something I'd grown accustomed to, but that day was different. They called my military career just an army job, with dismissive sneers and condescending glances. Little did they know what that uniform really meant, or what I had done while wearing it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The courthouse in our small Texas town had stood for over a century, witnessing countless family feuds, but none quite like ours. I shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench, feeling naked without my uniform. The inheritance dispute had been brewing since Uncle Robert passed, leaving behind not just money, but 3 oil-rich acres that had suddenly become the center of our family's universe. My cousins sat across the aisle, their postures perfect, clothes expensive, a stark contrast to my plain navy suit purchased specifically for this occasion. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing my way with thinly veiled disdain. The divide between us seemed wider than the Grand Canyon. My clients have maintained the family business for 15 years, their attorney announced, his voice carrying through the oak-paneled room, while their cousin chose to pursue, well, an army job. He gestured toward me with a dismissive flick of his wrist, emphasizing army job, as if describing something distasteful. Several relatives chuckled. Aunt Patricia covered her mouth but couldn't hide her smirk. Uncle James nodded approvingly at the lawyer's words. The weight of their judgment pressed down on my shoulders, heavier than any rucksack I'd carried overseas. A woman with an army job, the attorney continued, who has contributed nothing to the family legacy. I clenched my jaw, feeling my fingernails dig into my palms. 5 tours of duty reduced to a punchline. Years of service, leadership, and sacrifice dismissed with a sneer and a clever turn of phrase. My mother sat beside me, her hand occasionally brushing mine, a silent plea for restraint. She'd begged me not to wear my uniform today, worried it would make things worse. Now I regretted listening. At least in uniform, I carried my identity, my achievements. Here, in civilian clothes, I felt stripped of both my dignity and the armor I'd worn for years. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Second cousins I barely knew leaned toward each other, exchanging comments behind cupped hands. Even Mrs. Henderson, my fourth-grade teacher, sat among them, her eyes avoiding mine when I tried to catch her gaze. I straightened my spine, muscle memory from years of standing at attention. The lawyer continued his opening statement, painting me as an absentee relative who suddenly appeared when money was at stake. Each word twisted the truth, but I remained silent, the discipline of military service keeping me composed, even as anger burned beneath my skin. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about respect for my choices, my service, my life. As I sat there, surrounded by family yet utterly alone, I wondered if anything could bridge the gulf between us, or if blood truly was thinner than oil in Texas. The lawyer representing my cousins stood with practiced confidence, his expensive suit a stark contrast to my department store attire. He gestured dismissively toward me, his voice dripping with condescension. Your Honor, we're asked to consider the defendant's career choices, he said, pausing for effect. Just an army job, really. Nothing that would qualify her to manage family assets of this magnitude. Laughter rippled through the gallery, starting with my cousins in the front row. Their matching smirks cut through me like shrapnel. I kept my face neutral, the way I'd learned to do during dress downs from commanding officers. But this was different. Those had been professional. This was personal. The oak-paneled walls seemed to amplify every chuckle, every whispered comment. She couldn't even finish college, I heard someone murmur. The courtroom's acoustics carried each word directly to my ears, as if designed specifically to maximize my humiliation. I scanned the room, searching for a friendly face. My gaze landed on Sarah Mitchell, my childhood friend. We climbed trees together, shared secrets under summer stars, and promised to be in each other's wedding someday. Now, she deliberately avoided eye contact, having chosen a seat in the far corner of the courtroom. When our eyes accidentally met, Sarah quickly looked down at her smartphone. The message was clear. She wouldn't be caught in the crossfire of family drama. The betrayal stung worse than the mockery. At least my cousins had always been transparent in their disdain. The temperature in the room seemed to drop with each passing minute. I pulled my jacket tighter, wondering if anyone else felt the chill, or if it was just the cold reality of standing alone. The defendant's military service, while admirable in its own limited way, the lawyer continued, hardly prepares one for the complexities of property management and investment strategies. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside me. I could feel her silent plea to remain calm, to not make a scene. My father sat stoically on her other side, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. The lawyer turned toward the judge with a practiced smile. Your Honor, will demonstrate that the plaintiff's experience with real estate and business management makes them far better suited to handle the estate than someone whose primary skill is following orders. More laughter, more whispers, more isolation. I thought of my unit overseas, how we'd formed bonds stronger than blood under the harshest conditions imaginable. How ironic that here, surrounded by blood relatives, I'd never felt more alone. The courtroom air grew heavier with each breath, weighed down by judgment and the bitter taste of abandonment. As the lawyer's mocking tone filled the courtroom, my mind drifted away from the polished oak benches and whispered judgments. The cold Texas courtroom faded, replaced by memories of nights in distant lands where stars hung differently in the sky. I remembered leading my unit through a mountain pass, the weight of responsibility heavier than any rucksack. Those soldiers had trusted me with their lives, following without question when I signaled to move forward through territory we knew held danger. The cousins exchanged another smug glance across the aisle, and I felt my jaw tighten. How could I explain to them what it meant to hold a dying comrade while calling for medevac? Or the bone-deep exhaustion after 72 hours without sleep, still making decisions that others depended on? These were the memories that sustain me now, not as war stories to impress a crowd, but as private reminders of who I truly was. My service had forged bonds stronger than blood. I thought of Martinez, who'd carried an injured soldier 3 miles after our transport was hit, and Ramirez, who taught me to play chess by flashlight during sandstorms when we couldn't move out. These people knew my true worth. While here, surrounded by family, I was reduced to someone with an army job. A particularly loud snicker from one of my cousins pulled me back to the present. The lawyer was now describing my military career as playing soldier while the rest of the family built something meaningful. Each word was a deliberate barb, designed to diminish everything I'd sacrificed. Years of training, deployments that stretched endlessly, missing birthdays and funerals and holidays, all of it dismissed with casual cruelty. I felt heat rising in my chest, the familiar surge of anger that in combat would sharpen into focus. But here, it had nowhere to go. So I did what the Army had taught me. I controlled my breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The discipline that had kept me alive overseas now kept me from leaping to my feet in outrage. My fingers traced the edge of the wooden table, focusing on its smooth texture. The Army had taught me patience, waiting in position for hours, enduring discomfort without complaint, staying silent when every instinct screamed to speak. That same patience would serve me now. I straightened my back, the posture of attention so deeply ingrained it came without thought. Let them laugh, let them mock. They couldn't take away what I'd earned through blood and sacrifice. The truth of who I was existed beyond their understanding. And for now, that knowledge would have to be enough. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside me on the hard wooden bench. Her hands, weathered from years of quiet work at home, trembled slightly as she reached for my sleeve. I felt the gentle tug, an urgent plea wrapped in maternal concern. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the courtroom. "Don't cause a scene." Her eyes, wide with anxiety, darted between my face and the smirking cousins across the aisle. "We just need to get through this day." The courthouse air felt heavy, laden with decades of family history and unspoken resentments. My mother's fingers remained on my arm, as if physically restraining the words building inside me. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts at holiday dinners, who changed subjects when conversations grew heated. "They're not worth it," she added, nodding toward my cousins and their attorney, who continued to cast dismissive glances our way. "Just let the judge handle this." I understood her fear. In our small Texas community, reputation was currency, and confrontation was rarely forgotten. She had watched me leave for the army years ago, had prayed for my safety in distant lands, only to now fear a different kind of battle on home soil. But her plea for silence only intensified the war raging within me. Should I honor her wishes, swallow my pride, and let these insults pass unchallenged? The discipline instilled through years of military service had taught me when to advance and when to hold position. Yet something fundamental felt at stake, not just an inheritance dispute, but the value of service itself. My father sat on my other side, his weathered face impassive. Unlike my mother, he offered no words of caution, no pleas for restraint. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet confidence that truth would eventually prevail. I placed my hand over my mother's and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I understand," I whispered back, though I wasn't sure I did. The courtroom continued its proceedings around us, but I remained caught between two duties: respecting my mother's wish for peace and defending the honor of a uniform that had become as much a part of me as my own skin. The judge glanced our way, his experienced eyes perhaps noticing our whispered exchange. For a moment, I wondered if he could see the conflict written across my face. The soldier trained to stand firm against opposition, and the daughter raised to avoid making waves. The lawyer's voice had risen to a crescendo, each word dripping with disdain as he referred once again to my little army job. Laughter rippled through the courtroom like a cruel wave, washing over me as I sat rigid in my chair. My cousins exchanged smug glances, their polished appearances a stark contrast to my simple suit. Just as another barb was about to be launched, Judge Harold Winters raised his hand. The gesture was unhurried yet commanding, silencing the room instantly. The elderly man, with silver hair and deep-set eyes that had witnessed decades of human drama, surveyed the courtroom with deliberate care. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority without needing to be raised. "I believe we're getting sidetracked from the matters at hand." The sudden silence felt almost physical. Even the ancient ceiling fan seemed to slow its creaking, rotation in deference to the judge's intervention. "Before we continue," Judge Winters continued, adjusting his glasses, "I'd like to review the service record of the defendant." His gaze shifted to me, not with the pity I'd grown accustomed to, but with something resembling respect. My cousin's lawyer stood abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I failed to see how military service is relevant to this inheritance dispute." His confidence had faltered slightly, replaced by a defensive edge. The judge's expression remained impassive. "I'll determine what's relevant in my courtroom, counselor." He gestured to the court clerk. "Please obtain the complete service record for review." I watched my cousins shift uncomfortably in their seats. The older one whispered something to their attorney, who shook his head in frustration. The atmosphere in the room had transformed, the mockery replaced by an uncertain tension. Mother squeezed my hand beneath the table, her fingers trembling slightly. She had always feared confrontation, always urged peace at any cost, but even she seemed to sense the shifting tide. "Your Honor," the lawyer tried again, "we have a tight schedule today and we have all the time necessary to conduct these proceedings properly," Judge Winters interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. His eyes, which I now noticed, held the weathered look of someone who had seen more than courthouse dramas, fixed on the attorney with unmistakable displeasure. The clerk approached with a folder, and the judge accepted it with a nod. As he opened it, I noticed his fingers, steady and purposeful, tracing the embossed seal of the United States Army. Something in his manner, in the reverent way he handled those documents, told me he understood service in a way the others in this room never could. For the first time since entering the courthouse, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. I returned home that evening, my mind still replaying the courtroom mockery like a broken record. The small Texas house felt different somehow. Not the sanctuary it had once been, but another battlefield where my service seemed diminished. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes filling the uncomfortable silence between us. I could tell she wanted to say something by the way she kept glancing in my direction, her hands trembling slightly as she dried the same plate 3 times over. "I need to show you something," she finally said, wiping her hands on her apron. She led me to the guest bedroom, opening the bottom drawer of an old oak dresser. There, beneath folded linens that smelled of mothballs, lay my medals, including the Medal of Honor, wrapped in tissue paper as if they were shameful secrets. "I put them away when the Hendersons came for dinner last month," she explained, not meeting my eyes. "I thought they might feel uncomfortable seeing them displayed." You know how people talk in this town. The revelation hit me like shrapnel. My own mother had hidden the physical symbols of my sacrifice, not out of shame, but something that cut deeper: misguided protection. "Uncomfortable?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter. "These medals represent Americans I served with, people who didn't come home." She touched my arm gently. "I just didn't want to cause a fuss. Your father said I was wrong, but I thought—" Her voice trailed off as she realized the impact of her actions. I lifted the Medal of Honor from its tissue paper grave, feeling its weight in my palm. Each ounce represented blood and courage that couldn't be understood by those who mocked my army job. Yet here it lay, hidden away like contraband. "I earned this," I said quietly. "Not just for me, but for my unit. For the country these people claim to love so much." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel this way." I understood her intention: to shield me from judgment, to keep peace in a town where military service was often reduced to a footnote unless it fit neatly into patriotic holiday celebrations. But her well-meaning gesture had only reinforced what the courthouse had begun: the erasure of my achievements, my honor, my story. That night, I removed every medal from the drawer and arranged them on my dresser. They weren't decorations or conversation pieces. They were chapters of my life written in metal and ribbon, testimonies to moments when courage overcame fear. If my own family could hide these symbols, how could I expect respect from cousins who saw only dollar signs where family ties should be? The courtroom's oak panels seemed to absorb every sound as Judge Harrison reopened the proceedings. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles across the polished floor. I sat with my hands folded, trying to project a composure I didn't feel. My mother squeezed my arm gently, her earlier pleas for silence still echoing in my mind. The judge reached for a thick manila folder that hadn't been there yesterday. His weathered fingers traced the embossed presidential seal on its cover with a reverence that made the courtroom collectively hold its breath. My cousins exchanged confused glances across the aisle, their expensive suits suddenly seeming less like armor. Before we continue with financial matters, Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying to every corner, I've taken the liberty of requesting some additional documentation regarding the defendant's service record. My cousin's lawyer half rose from his seat. Your Honor, I fail to see how military paperwork is relevant to this inheritance dispute. The judge fixed him with a steady gaze that made the attorney slowly sink back into his chair. Relevance will become apparent, counselor. With deliberate care, he opened the folder and adjusted his reading glasses. What happened next transformed the atmosphere of the entire room. The President of the United States of America. America, Judge Harrison began reading, his voice taking on a formal cadence. Authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to... He read my full name, rank, and unit. The words hung in the air like physical things. I felt my throat tighten as memories flooded back. The firefight, the wounded soldiers, the decisions made in seconds that had defined years afterward. The judge continued reading the citation, describing actions I'd performed that terrible day. His crisp, clear voice detailed each moment with military precision, slicing through the courtroom's stunned hush. The same relatives who had been whispering behind their hands now sat frozen, eyes widening as the magnitude of what they were hearing sank in. My cousin's lawyer, who had mockingly referred to my Army job just yesterday, now stared at his legal pad, his pen motionless. The court reporter's fingers paused briefly before resuming their steady rhythm. When Judge Harrison reached the description of how I'd risked my life to save 3 wounded comrades under heavy fire, I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath beside me. She hadn't known the details. I'd never shared them, not even with family. The laughter that had filled the courtroom earlier had vanished completely, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. In that moment, I realized the power of truth simply spoken aloud. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom as he read the Medal of Honor citation, each word hanging in the air like a physical presence. The description of my actions overseas, leading a rescue mission under heavy fire, carrying 2 wounded soldiers to safety despite my own injuries, transformed the atmosphere completely. Where moments before there had been snickering and side glances, now there was only stunned silence. My cousins, who had been leaning toward each other exchanging whispers throughout the proceedings, now sat rigid in their chairs. The woman who had dismissed my military career as insignificant stared straight ahead, her face drained of color. Her brother beside her studied the floor with sudden fascination. Their lawyer, who had been so eager to mock my Army job, stood frozen at his table, his pen suspended above his legal pad. The smug confidence that had defined his demeanor all morning had evaporated, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. I kept my eyes forward, my posture straight, the same discipline that had carried me through firefights now steadying me through this unexpected moment of vindication. My mother's hand found mine beneath the table, her fingers trembling slightly as she squeezed. I could feel her silent apology for hiding my medals, for asking me to diminish myself. In the back of the courtroom, 3 reporters who had been half dozing through what they'd expected to be a routine inheritance dispute were now frantically writing. One woman with horn-rimmed glasses caught my eye and nodded slightly, a gesture of respect that felt more genuine than any I'd received since returning home. The judge continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each paragraph. As a Vietnam veteran himself, he understood the weight of these words, the blood and sacrifice behind each clinical description of valor. When he mentioned the lives saved through my actions, someone in the gallery let out an audible gasp. Even the bailiff, who had maintained professional detachment throughout the proceedings, stood a little straighter, his eyes flickering toward me with newfound recognition. The acoustics of the oak-paneled room seemed to change. The same space that had amplified every mocking laugh now carried the solemn weight of sacrifice and duty. The polished floor that had echoed with dismissive footsteps now seemed to hold its breath. A ceiling fan turned lazily overhead, its soft whirring the only sound besides the judge's steady recitation. In that moment, I realized that respect couldn't be demanded, but sometimes truth spoken aloud was powerful enough to command it anyway. "Objection, Your Honor!" My cousin's lawyer shot to his feet, his expensive suit suddenly looking too tight around the collar. "This citation has no bearing on the inheritance dispute before us today." His voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there minutes before, when he'd been confidently mocking my military career. The judge paused, setting down the Medal of Honor citation with deliberate care. His weathered hands rested on the document as he fixed the attorney with a steady gaze. "On what grounds do you object, counselor?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. The lawyer shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the courtroom's attention. "Relevance, Your Honor. My client's cousin's military decorations, however, impressive, don't affect the distribution of family assets according to Texas law." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The same people who had laughed at the lawyer's jokes minutes earlier now exchanged uncomfortable glances. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'll tell you what's relevant in my courtroom," the judge replied, each word measured and precise. "Character is relevant. Honor is relevant. And showing proper respect to a Medal of Honor recipient is certainly relevant." The attorney's face flushed red. "Your Honor, I meant no disrespect." "And yet disrespect is precisely what you've shown," the judge cut in. "Perhaps if you'd done your due diligence before characterizing the defendant's career as just an army job, we wouldn't need this correction." From the back of the courtroom, I noticed a reporter lean forward, pen poised eagerly above his notepad. This wasn't the small-town inheritance squabble he'd expected to cover today. My cousins whispered urgently to their lawyer, their previously smug expressions replaced by something approaching panic. The oldest one, the ringleader who had initiated this whole legal battle, stared at me as though seeing me for the first time. The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may approach—" "You may sit down," the judge interrupted. "Objection overruled. I will continue reading this citation, and this court will show the appropriate respect." As the lawyer sank back into his chair, I felt something shift in the room, and within myself. The power dynamic that had defined this case from the beginning had suddenly inverted. The whispers and mockery that had followed me through my hometown since my return had been silenced by the judge's words. For the first time since coming home, I didn't feel diminished. My service record, the very thing my family had treated as an embarrassing footnote, now commanded the room. The respect I'd earned through sacrifice was finally, publicly acknowledged. The judge picked up the citation again and continued reading. The morning after the judge read my citation, I stepped outside my parents' house to find our driveway lined with newspapers. The front page of the Texas Tribune carried a headline that made my stomach drop. "Medal of Honor recipient faces family trial in inheritance dispute." My service record, once a private matter of pride, had become public spectacle overnight. My phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years flooded in. Neighbors, former classmates, even the barista at the local coffee shop who had always served me with polite indifference. Some messages carried apologies, others admiration, but all carried the weight of changed perception. "I had no idea," wrote Melissa Jenkins, who sat behind me in high school chemistry and had snickered with my cousins just days earlier in the courthouse. "My brother served in Afghanistan. I should have known better." The small-town social landscape shifted like Texas weather, sudden and dramatic. At the grocery store, people who once averted their eyes now offered handshakes. The cashier, an elderly woman who had known my family for decades, refused to let me pay. "Your money's no good here today," she insisted, her eyes misting over. Even the local diner, where my cousins had held court for years, became uncomfortable territory for them. The owner, a gruff man with 2 sons in the military, reportedly asked them to leave when they complained about the trial's coverage. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns. My father brought home each newspaper, silently adding them to his growing collection. He never mentioned it, but I caught him reading the articles with quiet pride when he thought no one was looking. The most surprising call came from Mayor Wilson himself, inviting me to speak at the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. "The town needs to hear your story," he said, his voice carrying an unusual note of humility. My mother watched this transformation with worried eyes. "This attention will pass," she cautioned as we sat on the porch swing that evening. "People have short memories." But I knew something fundamental had changed. The whispers that followed me down Main Street carried respect now, not ridicule. The inheritance dispute that had brought us to court faded into the background as the community grappled with its treatment of a decorated veteran who had walked among them unrecognized. That night, I stood at my bedroom window, watching the Texas stars. For the first time since returning home, I felt seen, not as someone's daughter or cousin, not as a woman with just an army job, but as myself. The tide had shifted, and with it, my place in the town I'd always called home. The courtroom fell into its familiar rhythm as we entered the third week of proceedings. I watched as the judge, a man whose stern demeanor had initially intimidated me, adjusted his glasses and reviewed the documents before him. There was something different about him today, a contemplative look that hadn't been there before. "Before we continue," he announced, his voice carrying through the oak-paneled room, "I'd like to address something personal." The unexpected statement caused a ripple of murmurs among the spectators. My cousins exchanged glances across the aisle, their polished appearances betraying no emotion beyond mild curiosity. Their lawyer straightened his tie, clearly annoyed at the interruption to his carefully planned strategy. "I served in Vietnam," the judge continued, his eyes briefly meeting mine. "First Infantry Division, 1968 to 70. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "I don't often speak of it in this courtroom, but I believe context matters here." The revelation hung in the air. Suddenly, his previous interest in my service record made perfect sense. This wasn't just professional courtesy. It was the recognition of shared experience, a brotherhood of service that transcended generations and conflicts. "Your Honor," my cousin's attorney began, clearly attempting to redirect. "While we respect your service, I fail to see the relevance." The judge raised his hand, silencing the lawyer with a gesture that brooked no argument. "The relevance, counselor, is that I understand the weight of military decorations. They aren't handed out like participation trophies." I sat straighter, feeling a strange kinship with this man I barely knew. He had walked similar paths, faced similar demons. The quiet dignity with which he acknowledged his service mirrored what I had tried to maintain throughout this ordeal. My mother squeezed my hand beneath the table, her earlier anxiety seemingly tempered by this unexpected ally. Even my father, who had remained stoically silent throughout most proceedings, nodded slightly in recognition of a fellow veteran. "This court will continue to evaluate the inheritance claims based on legal merit," the judge clarified, "but I will not permit the diminishment of military service in my courtroom." As proceedings resumed, I noticed subtle changes in how he managed the case. Not favoritism, but a level of respect that had been missing in the early days. He asked more pointed questions of my cousin's witnesses, demanded clearer evidence, and maintained a standard of decorum that prevented further mockery. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt truly seen, not as a curiosity or an outsider, but as someone whose choices and sacrifices were understood by at least one person in this room. The judge's revelation had changed nothing legally, but it had shifted everything emotionally. The battle was far from over, but knowing I wasn't fighting alone made all the difference. Every night, I'd sit on the edge of my bed, turning my Medal of Honor over in my hands, its weight somehow heavier now than when the president had placed it around my neck. The medal caught the lamplight, reflecting questions I couldn't answer. The courthouse battle had transformed. What began as a bitter inheritance dispute had become something else entirely: a public referendum on military service and respect. Letters arrived daily from veterans across Texas, thanking me for standing tall. Local reporters called, seeking interviews about my service rather than the family drama. Yet my mother's words, "Don't cause a scene," echoed in my mind like a command I couldn't disobey. She meant well, always had. Her generation believed in quiet dignity, in handling family matters behind closed doors. Each morning at breakfast, she'd slide the newspaper away from me, trying to shield me from the headlines my case was generating. "You don't need to say anything more," she insisted, pouring coffee with slightly trembling hands. "The judge knows the truth now. Let it rest." My father, sitting silently at the table's end, would meet my eyes briefly, his gaze communicating what his words didn't. Unlike my mother, he understood that some battles needed fighting in the open. At night, I'd call my army mentor, the woman who'd guided me through my darkest days overseas. "The hardest part of service isn't what happens in combat," she reminded me. "It's carrying those experiences when you come home, deciding which stories to tell and which to keep sacred." I paced my small bedroom, caught between worlds. The disciplined soldier in me wanted to maintain tactical silence, to win through action rather than words. But the citizen in me recognized that silence often preserved injustice. My cousins had used my restraint against me. Their lawyer had twisted my modesty into something shameful. Would my continued silence be read as weakness or strength? In the bathroom mirror, I practiced what I might say in court, my voice sometimes strong, sometimes faltering. The words felt foreign in my mouth after years of letting my service speak for itself. The veterans organization's calling offered a platform I'd never sought. Speaking publicly would mean exposing not just my achievements, but my vulnerabilities. The fear, the doubt, the nights when courage came at tremendous cost. Each morning, I'd wake to the same question: was I betraying my mother's wishes for peace by considering speaking out? Or was I betraying my own hard-won truth by remaining silent? The courtroom awaited my decision. The judge, himself a veteran, had created space for my voice. Now I had to decide whether to fill it. The tide had turned so dramatically that I could hardly believe it. My cousins, who had swaggered into the courthouse with such confidence, now found themselves facing the cold shoulder from the very community that had once embraced them. Their arrogance, displayed so openly during the early days of the trial, was backfiring spectacularly. I first noticed the change at the local diner. As I sat alone with my coffee one morning, Mrs. Winters, who owned the establishment, approached my table. She had barely acknowledged me before, but now she refilled my cup without asking and leaned in close. "My brother served in Desert Storm," she confided. "What they said about your service, it wasn't right." Later that week, I spotted one of my cousins at the grocery store. Two women who had been chatting animatedly fell silent as he approached, then deliberately turned their shopping carts down another aisle. His face flushed with the unmistakable recognition of being snubbed. The small Texas town had its own justice system outside the courthouse walls. Invitations to community functions that had once automatically included my relatives now mysteriously failed to arrive at their homes. Their phones rang less frequently. Even at church, I noticed people leaving conspicuous empty spaces in pews around them. "They're saying Thomas and his brothers have no respect for what you sacrificed," my father told me quietly one evening. "The Millers canceled their business contract with them yesterday." The whispers that had once circled around me, questioning my choices, diminishing my service, had found new targets. Now it was my cousin's lack of gratitude and shallow values that became the subject of town gossip. Their standing in the community, built over generations of local prominence, eroded with surprising speed. My mother noticed too, though it troubled her in a different way. "This town has always been too quick to judge," she said, folding laundry with more force than necessary. "First you, now them." I understood what she meant. There was something uncomfortable about watching the social pendulum swing so dramatically. The same neighbors who had once smirked behind their hands at my army job were now performing outrage on my behalf. Yet I couldn't deny feeling a certain vindication. Not because my cousin suffered, but because the truth about military service, about sacrifice and honor, was finally being acknowledged in my hometown. The lawyer who had mocked me so openly now hurried through town with his head down, his earlier courtroom bravado nowhere to be seen. His reputation had become collateral damage in a battle he hadn't anticipated. "Small towns have long memories," my father observed, "and they don't forget disrespect." He was right. The social reversal wasn't just about me. It was about what I represented. Something deeper than family squabbles or inheritance disputes. Something that, once recognized, couldn't be unseen or forgotten. While my mother struggled openly with the court proceedings, my father remained a steadfast pillar of quiet strength. Each morning, he would sit at our kitchen table, methodically going through the local newspaper with a pair of scissors that had belonged to his own father. I noticed this ritual, but thought little of it, assuming he was clipping coupons or following some obscure hobby he'd developed in retirement. He never spoke much about the case, offering only brief nods of encouragement or a gentle squeeze of my shoulder when tensions ran particularly high. Unlike the rest of the town, whose opinions seemed to shift with each new headline, my father's belief in me never wavered. "Truth stands on its own 2 feet," he would say, on the rare occasions when I questioned whether the fight was worth it. His weathered hands would return to whatever task occupied them, the conversation seemingly closed, but his support unmistakably clear. It wasn't until 3 months after the verdict that I discovered what he'd been doing all along. While helping him organize the garage, a space that had become cluttered during the months we'd focused on legal battles, I came across a leather portfolio tucked behind his workbench. The binding was worn but carefully maintained, much like everything my father valued. Inside lay dozens of newspaper clippings, chronologically arranged and meticulously preserved in plastic sleeves. Every article about my service, the court case, and the subsequent community reaction had been saved. Some headlines proclaimed, "Local hero fights family in court," while others detailed my military accomplishments that had previously gone unacknowledged in our small Texas community. In the margins of several clippings, my father had written small notes. "Proud? They finally see. And my daughter." These simple words, written in his careful penmanship, spoke volumes more than any lengthy speech could have. When I confronted him about the collection, he simply shrugged. "Somebody ought to remember things right," he said, his eyes meeting mine briefly before returning to the task at hand. "History gets twisted otherwise." That evening, we sat together on the porch, the portfolio between us, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. No words were needed. His silent documentation of my journey had been the most profound support of all. A father's unwavering belief that truth would eventually prevail, preserved one newspaper clipping at a time. After 6 grueling months of hearings, depositions, and legal maneuvering, the day of reckoning finally arrived. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with even standing room filled by curious townspeople who had followed the increasingly public dispute. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the judge entered and took his seat. The judge cleared his throat, his Vietnam veteran's pin catching the light as he adjusted his robes. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he began, his voice steady and measured. This court rules in favor of the defendant. My heart skipped a beat. I had won. The inheritance, my grandmother's house and the 5 acres of land that had been in our family for generations, would remain with me as she had intended. Furthermore, the judge continued, I find the plaintiff's arguments not only legally insufficient, but ethically questionable. He looked directly at my cousins, whose faces had drained of color. This court gives significant weight to the defendant's demonstrated character and credibility, as evidenced by her exemplary military service and the highest honor our nation bestows. My cousin's lawyer shuffled papers nervously, avoiding eye contact with his clients. The gallery behind me erupted in hushed whispers. My father reached over and squeezed my hand, his calloused palm warm against mine. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with their microphones and cameras. I declined to comment, walking briskly past them with my parents flanking me like protective sentries. Victory should have felt sweeter than this hollow ache in my chest. That evening, sitting on my parents' porch swing, I watched the Texas sunset paint the sky in fiery oranges and reds. My mother brought out sweet tea, setting the glass beside me without a word. We won, I said finally. But at what cost? She nodded, understanding the true price of this battle. 3 cousins I'd grown up with now refused to speak to me. 2 aunts had deleted me from their social media accounts. The family reunions that once filled our summers would never be the same. The legal victory had reopened wounds I thought long healed. Memories of deployments when family members hadn't written, of homecomings where they'd asked superficial questions about my army job, while quickly changing the subject. Justice had been served in that oak-paneled courtroom, but some fractures ran too deep for any judge's ruling to repair. I took a long sip of tea, letting the sweetness wash away the bitterness that lingered. Some battles, my father said softly from the doorway, are worth fighting, even when victory hurts. He joined us on the porch, his quiet pride a balm to my wounded spirit. Word of the judge's verdict spread through our small Texas town like wildfire. By sunset, my phone was buzzing with notifications from local news outlets and social media. The headline in the county paper, read, Medal of Honor recipient vindicated in family court battle, complete with a photo of me leaving the courthouse, eyes forward, shoulders squared. 3 days after the ruling, I received a call from the Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter in Austin. The chapter president, a retired Marine, spoke with reverence when he mentioned my service record. We'd be honored if you would address our annual ceremony next month, he said. Your story needs to be heard. My hand tightened around the phone as memories flooded back. The weight of my pack, the taste of dust, the sound that still woke me from sleep some nights. Speaking meant dragging those moments into the light, examining them before strangers. It meant standing on a stage and becoming the very thing I'd avoided, visible. I'll need to think about it, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the invitation email on my device. My father walked in quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside me. He didn't speak, he rarely needed to, but his presence carried its own kind of strength. They want me to talk about what happened? I said finally. All of it. He nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around his own mug. "Some stories are heavy to carry alone," he said. "Maybe sharing the weight helps." I thought about the soldiers I'd served with, women who'd faced the same dismissal I had in that courtroom, men whose sacrifices went unacknowledged. I thought about young recruits who might someday sit in similar courtrooms, facing similar scorn. My mother entered, catching the tail end of our conversation. The worry lines around her eyes had softened since the verdict. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "You've been through enough." But as I looked at the email again, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. The mockery in that courtroom wasn't unique. It was a reflection of how many civilians viewed military service, especially for women. "I think I do have to," I replied. "Not for me, but for everyone who serves quietly, whose medals stay in drawers, whose citations are never read aloud." I typed my acceptance that night, knowing that public recognition would come with its own price. Reopening wounds, reliving trauma, standing in spotlights I'd spent years avoiding. But some battles needed to be fought in the open, where they could change not just one courtroom, but perhaps many hearts. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, as I was sorting through the stack of newspaper clippings my father had collected. Colonel Margaret Winters, my former commanding officer and mentor during my second deployment, spoke with the same direct tone that had guided me through the most challenging moments of my service. "I've been following your case," she said without preamble. "The whole thing's been making rounds even in military circles." I sank into my chair, surprised by the familiar voice that instantly transported me back to forward operating bases and tactical briefings. Margaret had been the one who recommended me for special assignments, who pushed me when others thought I couldn't handle the pressure. "You've always been a soldier first," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "But now you have an opportunity to be something more." The colonel explained how my story had resonated with female service members across multiple branches. Young women in basic training were discussing the court case, finding inspiration in how I stood my ground. "You can change how people see servicewomen," she said firmly, "not just as warriors, but as people deserving of the same respect given to their male counterparts." I gazed out my window at the Texas evening, watching neighbors walk their dogs along sidewalks where I'd once played as a child. These were the same streets where people had whispered about my Army job, as if it were a hobby rather than a vocation. "I'm not looking to be anyone's spokesperson," I admitted, voicing the hesitation that had been building since the verdict. Margaret's laugh crackled through the phone. "Neither was I, but sometimes the mission finds you rather than the other way around." She reminded me of the women who had paved the way before us, those who had fought not just America's enemies, but also prejudice and dismissal within their own ranks. Their battles had made my service possible, she argued, and now I had a chance to continue that legacy. "Think about the young woman sitting in some small town right now, wondering if her dreams of service matter," my mentor said. "Your story tells her they do." After we hung up, I sat with her words for a long time. The weight of my experiences, both in combat and in that courtroom, had felt like a burden to bear alone. Now Margaret had helped me see it differently, not as weight, but as strength that could lift others. The following morning, I called the Veterans Organization in Austin and accepted their invitation to speak. The nervousness remained, but something else had taken root alongside it, a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own vindication. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was sorting through the stack of mail that had accumulated during the trial. My phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in years, but instantly recognized. Sarah Miller, my best friend throughout elementary and high school, was calling after nearly a decade of silence. "I saw you in the Gazette," she said, her voice tentative, almost fragile. I I don't even know where to begin. Sarah had been conspicuously absent during the entire ordeal with my cousins. We'd grown up sharing everything, from secret hideouts to teenage heartbreaks. But when the inheritance dispute became public, she had vanished from my life. During the trial, I'd spotted her once in town, watched her duck into a store to avoid me. I was a coward, she admitted as we sat across from each other at Rosie's diner the next day. The familiar smell of coffee and pie surrounded us, a comforting backdrop to an uncomfortable conversation. When everyone started taking sides, I just froze. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't get involved. Her eyes, rimmed with unshed tears, finally met mine. Then I read about what you did overseas, the Medal of Honor. All this time I had no idea. I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers. Most people didn't. That was kind of the point. Your cousins and their fancy lawyer made you sound so insignificant, Sarah continued, shaking her head. And I just stood by. What kind of friend is that? The Sarah sitting before me was different from the confident girl I remembered, humbled perhaps by her own recognition of failure. Yet in her remorse, I found something unexpected, healing. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said, sliding a small package across the table. But I wanted you to have this. Inside was a faded photograph of us at 16, arms linked, standing before the town's Veterans Memorial. We'd been assigned a school project about service and sacrifice. Even then, I'd known my path. You always were the brave one, she whispered. As we parted that afternoon, something shifted inside me. The validation from strangers, the headlines, the ceremony invitations had been affirming, but this reconnection with Sarah touched something deeper. It wasn't just about public recognition. It was about personal reconciliation. Sometimes, I realized, the hardest battles aren't fought under fire, but in the quiet moments of forgiveness. And sometimes, victory comes not with medals or court decisions, but with the healing of relationships once thought lost forever. The Austin Convention Center hummed with anticipation as veterans from across Texas gathered for the annual ceremony. I adjusted my dress uniform, fingers tracing the weight of medals that had once been hidden away in my mother's drawer. The master of ceremonies announced my name, his voice carrying through speakers to every corner of the hall. As I walked toward the stage, my footsteps seemed to echo in time with my heartbeat. 500 people rose to their feet in unison, their applause washing over me like a wave. The sound was deafening, a thunderous recognition that made my throat tighten with emotion. From the podium, I could see faces I'd known my entire life. My father stood tall, his weathered hands clapping steadily, eyes shining with quiet pride. Beside him, my mother dabbed at tears with a handkerchief, her shoulders straight despite her trembling hands. The woman who had once begged me not to cause a scene was now witnessing one created in my honor. Most surprising were my cousins, standing awkwardly at the back of the hall. Their presence was unexpected, perhaps driven by shame, perhaps by genuine regret. Whatever brought them here, they stood with everyone else, applauding with the crowd. The Medal of Honor is not given lightly, I began, my voice steadier than I felt, and neither is the respect we owe to every person who serves. As I shared my story, not just of combat, but of coming home to fight battles I never anticipated, I watched understanding dawn on faces throughout the audience. Veterans nodded in recognition of shared experiences. Civilians listened with newfound appreciation. The judge, who had changed everything, sat in the front row, his Vietnam service pins gleaming on his lapel. He gave me a subtle nod of acknowledgement, one soldier to another. When I finished speaking, the applause returned, even louder than before. People I'd grown up with, who had whispered behind their hands in that courtroom months ago, now looked at me with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not curiosity, respect. My childhood friend rushed forward after the ceremony, enveloping me in a tight hug. "I should have stood by you from the beginning," she whispered. In that moment, surrounded by the community that had once felt so foreign, I realized the sting of mockery had been replaced by something far more powerful. This validation wasn't just coming from strangers who read about medals in newspapers. It came from the people who mattered most, the ones who had finally learned to see beyond the uniform to the person who wore it. The courthouse battle had ended months ago, but its ripples continued to spread through my life in ways I never anticipated. Standing at the edge of the Veterans Ceremony stage in Austin, I gazed at the sea of faces, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all united by a shared understanding of service and sacrifice. My journey from that cold Texas courtroom, where my cousins and their attorney had reduced my military career to a punchline, to this moment of recognition had been transformative. The Medal of Honor that my mother had once hidden in a drawer, so guests wouldn't feel uncomfortable, now hung prominently around my neck, catching the light as I moved. "Your story changed how I think about women in combat roles," a young recruit told me after my speech, her eyes bright with determination. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening, veterans sharing their own experiences of returning home, civilians expressing newfound appreciation for military service. My father approached quietly, his weathered hands holding a leather-bound album. "Been collecting these since the trial started," he said, opening it to reveal dozens of newspaper clippings chronicling my courtroom battle and subsequent recognition. His silent pride had been there all along, even when words failed him. The cousins who had once mocked me were notably absent from community events now. Their social standing had crumbled under the weight of their disrespect, their prosperity unable to purchase back the goodwill they had squandered. The lawyer who had sneered at my army job had even sent a formal letter of apology, though whether from genuine remorse or concern for his professional reputation remained unclear. My army mentor watched from the sidelines, giving me an approving nod. "You've become the voice we needed," she said later, her hand firm on my shoulder. "Not just a soldier, but a bridge between military and civilian worlds." Even my mother had evolved, proudly introducing me to her friends as "my daughter, the Medal of Honor recipient," rather than asking me to downplay my achievements. Our relationship had healed through honest conversations about respect and recognition. The childhood friend who had reconnected after the trial now stood beside me at community events, her initial fear of controversy replaced by genuine support. "I should have stood by you from the beginning," she often said, a reminder that courage was contagious. As I left the ceremony that evening, walking through the warm Texas night, I realized that my greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom or even on the battlefield. It was in reclaiming my narrative and helping others find their voice. The dignity they had tried to strip away with laughter had only grown stronger through adversity. My story, once silenced, now echoed far beyond that small-town courtroom, a testament that true honor cannot be mocked, only earned and shared.